Hey guys, so my name's Timmy, and for my Indigenous 100 project, I am going to be talking about Australian First People, the original inhabitants of Australia, the continent, and I'm going to be talking about their culture, their way of life, um, their history, and then also the effect colonization had on their culture, and just how they've adapted over time and how they're surviving in modern day society, and I guess what's left of their culture. Um, so I'm just gonna get right into it. Okay, so Australia's first people. So a little bit about their history. Um, Aboriginal Australian Aboriginals are split into two different groups. So we have the Australian Aboriginal people who are related to those who, when Britain began colonizing the island in 1788, were related to those when Britain began colonizing the island in 1788, and then the Torres Strait Islander people who descend from residents of the Strait Torres Island, a group of islands as part of modern-day Queensland, Australia. So I'll be focusing on the Australian Aboriginal people. So Australia's first people could be the oldest populations of humans living outside of Africa. It's said that they migrated on boats about 70,000 years ago. Um, Australians' first people have been living on the continent for over 50 years. At the time of European settlement, there were 250 distinct language groups spread across Australia, but today there are currently only about 120 to 145, most of which are endangered. Um, most Australian Aboriginals used to be bilingual or multilingual, but today most of them speak Australian English. So their way of life. Some Australian Aboriginals lived as hunt-gatherers or foragers, which meant that they depended on domesticated species for food instead of agriculture. The men hunted and fished while the women gathered various foods and fruits. Um, some archaeologists argue that, you know, they had more sophisticated and complex methods uh, of agriculture, that wouldn't be described as hunting and gathering. But, based on my research, this is what I found. Australian Aboriginals were nomadic, but still grew a sense of attachment to their original site. So, to balance food with resources, people were dispersed into small groups. So, um, they lived in a dynamic community in which they moved to areas with the most food availability. So, they never stayed in one place. As soon as food became scarce, they had to move around, and this was obviously due to the fact that um, they didn't grow any crops or had any agriculture. They lived off of the natural land. So when there was no more food from the land, they moved somewhere else. They made canoes out of the bark of trees, and they also had fiber craft, which was very well developed. Fiber nets, baskets, and bags were used for hunting and carrying. So as you can see in those pictures, that's a canoe made out of a tree bark, and those are some of the equipment they used for hunting. So Australian Aboriginal spiritual beliefs. Um, Australian Aboriginals' religious beliefs were based on their reverence for the land and dreamtime. The dreaming was a complex process embodying the past, present, and future, as well as every aspect of life. Dreaming was used to represent a time, you know, Aboriginal concepts of everywhere during which the land was inhabited by ancestral figures with supernatural abilities. It said that knowledge in the dreaming was passed down through different stories, songlines, and dances and ceremonies, and provided a framework for ongoing relationships, kinship, responsibilities, and looking after a country. Christianity and European culture had a big impact on Australia's first people. Obviously because they colonized Australia. Um, yeah. Aboriginals, Australia's Aboriginals culture. Australia has a tradition of Aboriginal art, which are thousands of years old, the most common of which are bark and rock art. Aboriginal art can be traced back up to 30,000 years ago, which are found all over Australia. And during my research, I found that you know um, the art were drawn on rocks and in caves all over Australia, which people could still find today, and were used to tell their stories of their day, of their life. Way back then. Um, Music was also an integral part of their culture, socially, culturally, and used for ceremonial traditions. They had various instruments such as the didgeridoo, played by original men of the Eastern Kimberley region, the bull roarers, which you can see in one of the pictures, and the clapsticks. For recreation, they had ball games and games based on the use of weapons. One of the more popular games that was documented was the Man Grook, which you know it was a type of kick and catch football game with a ball that was made out of possum hide. So British colonization. When Britain began colonizing the island in 1788, it was said to have been about 750,000 to 1.25 million Australians living there. British colonization in Australia was unique because there was no treaty set up regarding terms of agreements for settlement, unlike in places like North America or New Zealand. And soon after the colonization, epidemics ravaged the Australian Aboriginal people. Um, and then there were a lot of conflict between the British and the Australian Aboriginal people because they kept on seizing their lands and their water resources and decimating their food products. Um, it was said that up to 20,000 Australian Aboriginals died in violent conflicts with the colony frontiers. Um, the colonization led to the impoverishment of Australian Aboriginal people, which also led to the stolen generations, which were children forcibly removed from their family and their communities by the Australian state and federal government and church missions. And the purpose was to eradicate Aboriginal culture. And when I did the research, the understanding behind this was that, based on the fact that they saw a decline in the population of the Australian Aboriginal people, they thought it would be ideal to, remove the children to kind of preserve their race and preserve their people. But the irony was that they were the one, causing the decline of their people. The Victorian Aboriginal Protection Act of 1869 was the earliest legislation to authorize child removal. So, contemporary issues. To this day, the removal of Australian Aboriginal children has had a huge impact on the psyche, the health, and well being of Australian Aboriginals. Due to the fact that the kids removed never got a chance to receive knowledge from their parents regarding their culture. A lot of the Australia Aboriginal culture was lost in their descendants and in today's generation. Um, and also, more issues facing them today are, compared to non-Indigenous population, there's a disparity in health, levels of education, employment, intergeneration trauma, which they're still going through today, high imprisonment rates, substance abuse, and lack of political representation. So Closing the Gap strategy was created in 2008 and coordinated by the National Indigenous Australian Agency, which aims to address many areas to improve the lives of Australian Aboriginals. So one of the biggest problems is that they always lacked political representation, and there was no one speaking for them. Um, so in 1937, William Cooper um, collect 1,800 signatures to petition King George VI for the representation of the original occupants of the land in federal parliament. Um, and then in 1938, January 26th, which is Australian Day, they had the first day of mourning to petition 150 years of callous treatment and seizure of their land. And as you can see in that picture, um, they, they were just protesting and demanding recognition and change from the government. Um, and today, in 1962, all Australian Aboriginals gained the unqualified right to vote in federal elections. As of January 2020, six Australian Aboriginals have been elected to the Australian Senate. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Commission, ATSIC, was set up as a representative body in 1990 by the Archie government. And then that was disbanded and then replaced with the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander Services, which is what um, they have today. So in 1991, the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation was established by the federal government to facilitate reconciliation between the non-Indigenous people and the Australian Aboriginals. An inquiry into the stolen generation showed that 10 to 33% of all Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their parents. In February 2008, for the first time, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd offered an official apology to Australia's Aboriginal people. And one of the biggest questions that I saw from my research is the question if you know um, the colonization was you know that the Australian First People faced, if it would be classified as a genocide. And based on the loss that they experienced, not just from their people but also their culture and from future generations. From my perspective, I would classify it as a genocide. I know Australian government has been taking steps to kind of remedy what they've done in the past and to help um, the Australian Aboriginal people. Um, and uh, you know it's not ideal, but this research really opened my eyes to the struggles of indigenous people, not just in Australia, but it seems all over the world. Being uprooted from their lands and just kind of you know forced into assimilating into a totally different culture. I hope you learned a lot from this presentation. Thank you for listening and for watching. And that is it.